Her name was Agnes. She was 22 years old, 5 feet tall, and had been in labor for 3 days. It is the winter of 1347, somewhere in rural England. The room smells like tallow candles, wet straw, and copper. That particular copper smell you never quite forget. Agnes is lying on a straw pallet on the dirt floor of a one-room cottage. 6 women surround her. None of them are doctors. The only one with any formal training is the midwife, a woman named Marjorie, who learned everything she knows from watching her own mother do this same thing, in this same kind of room, 30 years ago. Outside, Agnes's husband, Thomas, is forbidden from entering. He is pacing. He has been pacing for 3 days. He is praying to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, because that is the only thing left for him to do. Agnes doesn't know it yet, but the church has built an entire ceremony around what is happening to her. Not to celebrate the birth, not to welcome the child, to welcome the mother back if she survived. They called it the churching rite, and it began with the assumption that she might not. Let's go back to the beginning, because the story of medieval childbirth doesn't start in that straw-filled room. It starts months earlier, with a diagnosis that wasn't a diagnosis at all. You are a woman in 14th century Europe, 20 years old. You live in a village of perhaps 300 people somewhere in France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire. The details don't matter much because the experience is remarkably universal. You have recently missed your monthly flux, and your abdomen has begun to swell. Here is what the medical establishment of your era tells you about your condition. According to the Fistula, a collection of 3 medical texts on women's health circulating widely across Europe and reaching peak readership right around the turn of your century, your body is fundamentally cold and wet by nature. This makes you uniquely suited to gestation, but also uniquely fragile. The fetus inside you is sustained by your excess menstrual blood, redirected inward rather than flowing outward as usual. In the medieval medical imagination, pregnancy is essentially a woman's body turning its own waste product into a human being. Romantic, really. You will not see a physician. Men trained at universities like Bologna or Montpellier did not typically attend childbearing women. It was considered beneath them and theologically complicated. The female body was a site of dangerous, polluting mystery, and learned men preferred to theorize about it from a safe distance. Male physicians might prescribe remedies from across a curtain, but they were not coming in. What you will have is a midwife, and if you are lucky, a reasonably experienced one. The midwife advises you carefully. Red meat is too heating. Too much wine overheats the womb. But too little food starves the child. Walk, but not too much. Rest, but not too much. Every instruction comes with an equal and opposite counter-instruction, which means that whatever happens next, someone can retroactively say, you did something wrong. Now, here is what history textbooks gloss over in their enthusiasm for castle architecture and plague statistics. The risk of dying during or immediately after a single delivery was somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 50. Not dramatically higher than figures from 18th century lying-in hospitals, but in a world where most women faced this process between 4 and 8 times. The cumulative math is what kills you slowly on paper. By the 4th pregnancy, the risk has compounded. By the 6th, some historians estimate the lifetime odds of dying in childbed approached 1 in 5. You knew this. Every woman in your village knew this. You had helped in that straw-filled room yourself, holding someone's hand, changing linens, praying to St. Margaret, while the sounds from inside told you everything about how it was going. And then you got pregnant anyway, because the alternative, remaining childless in a society where a woman's entire value was tied to reproduction, was arguably worse. There was no neutral option. There was only do this or lose everything else. Congratulations. The village is pleased. The priest will say a blessing. You are quietly terrified. But the terror of pregnancy itself was just the prelude. Because when the labor actually began, you lost something most people today take completely for granted: control over the room. When your labor begins, the men leave. This is one of the few things period dramas get right about medieval childbirth. The birthing chamber, or, if you are poor, simply your one-room home hastily rearranged, is an entirely female space. Your husband is excluded. Your father is excluded. The priest might offer prayers from outside the door, but he is not coming in. The midwife holds an authority here that she holds almost nowhere else in 14th century society. The room has been prepared. Windows are covered. Drafts are believed to chill the womb and slow labor. The fire is stoked high. The air is brutally hot and thick with smoke. Candles burn everywhere because darkness invites malevolent spirits. Pennyroyal and St. John's wort are strewn on the floor, plants believed to ease the passage. Whether they do anything useful is a question the 14th century was not equipped to answer. You are wearing a birth girdle, a strip of parchment inscribed with prayers, sometimes the measurements of Christ's wounds, sometimes Psalm 91, tied around your waist or placed beneath you. The church discouraged purely magical charms, but tolerated the girdles because telling a screaming woman in active labor that her comfort object was theologically suspect was a conversation nobody wanted to have. The midwife's toolkit contains oil of almonds for lubrication, a knife, hooks. Those last two items are not for what you hope. They are exactly for what you fear. Your position is, by modern standards, wrong. You sit upright on a low birthing stool, leaning back against an assistant, letting gravity assist. This was the dominant practice across Europe. The upright position genuinely helps. On this one point, medieval obstetrics accidentally had it right. On almost every other point, it did not. If your labor stalls, and it stalled frequently because malnourishment, pelvic deformity from childhood rickets, and sheer exhaustion were all endemic, the midwife's options are grim. She might give you wine mixed with herbs, or a preparation containing powdered dried ants, which appears in multiple medieval recipes and whose mechanism of action remains, even now, entirely unclear. She might have all the women shout at once to shock you into productive contractions. She might bind your abdomen and physically push the child downward. If none of that works, she begins to pray in earnest. Because the next step is not something anyone in this room wants to reach. And when those prayers weren't enough, when the labor crossed from difficult into catastrophic, the midwife faced a decision so brutal that modern medicine has spent 5 centuries trying to ensure nobody ever has to make it again. Here is the question that sits at the dark center of every midwife's manual, every ecclesiastical ruling on the subject. When the labor goes truly, fatally wrong, do you save the mother or the child?
She is weakening.
In theory, the church had an answer. An unbaptized infant could not enter heaven. It was consigned to limbo, a theological space that most ordinary medieval Christians experienced as damnation adjacent. The moral mathematics seemed to favor the child. If you could save only one, save the one whose soul was in immediate spiritual peril, baptize it. At least one soul reached God safely. In practice, it was not that simple, and it was not that clean. When a birth becomes truly obstructed, the child lodged transverse, or simply too large for a pelvis narrowed by a childhood of poor nutrition, you face a situation with almost no safe options. Caesarean section existed in the medieval world, but it was performed almost exclusively on women already dying or dead in a last attempt to extract a living child. A caesarean on a living mother was a death sentence. Without anesthesia, sterile technique, or the ability to suture internal wounds, the operation invariably destroyed the patient. So the midwife's knife is used, in the worst obstructed labors, for craniotomy, the deliberate perforation and collapse of the fetal skull, compressing the head for extraction and saving your life at the cost of the child's. The Latin texts called it embryotomy, and described it with a matter-of-factness that reads today as almost surreal. The correct angle of the instrument, the force required, the technique for removing what remains. Nobody thought this was fine. The midwives who performed it went to confession afterward. Mothers who survived it sometimes did not speak of it for years. Some never did. But here is what the myth of medieval brutality gets wrong. These decisions were not made callously. The court records and midwives' testimonies that survive suggest these rooms were filled with anguish. The midwife, who was a neighbor, a friend, sometimes a relative, carried the weight for the rest of her life. The 14th century was not indifferent to the death of mothers. It was simply helpless to prevent it, and it had built a theology around that helplessness. One more layer the textbooks omit. If you died before the child was delivered, the midwife was legally and spiritually obligated, under ecclesiastical guidelines in England, to attempt baptism in utero if there was any sign of life, introducing consecrated water into the womb before delivery. The mechanics were not addressed by the guidelines. The guidelines were written by men who had never been in a birthing room. But let's say you survived. The child came out breathing, the knife stayed in its sheath, and you were still alive when the candles guttered out. The nightmare, it turns out, was not over. It had simply changed shape. You are alive. Your child is alive. Take a moment. In the 1300s, this is a genuinely remarkable outcome. Now, the next 6 weeks have their own arithmetic of death. The condition responsible was called childbed fever, fièvre puerpérale in French medical texts, and it followed the same pattern everywhere. 2 to 5 days after delivery, a woman who seemed to be recovering would spike a high fever, develop severe abdominal pain, and begin shaking violently. She would become delirious. Her abdomen would swell and harden. Within days, sometimes hours, she would be dead. We now know this was puerperal sepsis, bacterial infection of the uterus, introduced by unwashed hands, unsterilized instruments, contaminated linens. The uterus immediately after delivery is an open wound. In a 14th century birthing room, bacterial contamination was not the exception. It was the atmosphere. The medieval world did not know about bacteria. Germ theory was 5 centuries away. What it knew was that childbed fever was common and almost always fatal. What it did not know was that the interventions meant to help. Repeated internal examinations, manual removal of the placenta, herbal poultices applied directly, often made things catastrophically worse, introducing more contamination into an already infected wound. The more attentive the midwife, the higher the risk. The midwives who did the most were, in some cases, the most dangerous.
Father, and winter is upon us.
Counterintuitively,
I do not
wealthy
know how we
women
will feed the
sometimes
children.
fared
We
worse.
must have faith,
They could
Thomas.
afford learned physicians who visited post-delivery with hands that had, that same morning, handled a corpse during anatomical study. The connection between a physician's unwashed hands and patient death would not be demonstrated until Ignaz Semmelweis in 1847. Before that, 5 centuries of wealthy women died of infections delivered by the most educated hands in Europe. The poor, with fewer attendants and less intervention, sometimes had lower rates of puerperal fever. This is not an argument for poverty. It is one of history's more darkly absurd observations. There was also hemorrhage. Excessive post-delivery bleeding from a uterus failing to contract was the second leading killer. The 1300s response was prayer, manual massage, and ergot-based herbal preparations. Ergot, a fungus on rye grain, is the same substance from which modern ergometrine derives, still one of the most effective hemorrhage treatments in use today. The midwives didn't know why it worked. They knew it did, because they had watched it work. That is its own kind of science, conducted entirely without the vocabulary of science. And that brings us to the part of this story that the textbooks truly never mention: what surviving actually cost the women who made it. She made it. Agnes made it. 3 days of labor, a room full of smoke and whispered prayers. And Agnes is alive. The child is alive. And Marjorie the midwife is quietly washing her hands in the basin by the door with the focused efficiency of someone who has done this 40 times and does not allow herself to feel anything until she gets home. But Agnes is not, in any meaningful modern sense, fine. The most significant injury from difficult medieval labors was obstetric fistula, a tear between the birth canal and the bladder or rectum caused by prolonged obstruction, creating a permanent opening that could not be reliably repaired until the 19th century. Women with fistulae leaked urine or feces continuously. They were excluded from social spaces, sometimes from their own homes. They could not attend church. In a world where participation in religious life was the entire architecture of social belonging, exclusion from the nave was a form of civil death. The church issued bishops' dispensations, allowing fistula-affected women to receive communion privately, at home. Evidence, if you needed it, that the condition was common enough to require a formal ecclesiastical policy. Beyond fistula, pelvic floor damage that made walking painful for years, perineal tears that healed badly or not at all, prolapsed uteruses requiring a woman to manually reposition her own organs, while running a household, nursing a child, and being expected to be available for the next pregnancy within the year, because there was no protected recovery. The churching ceremony, the church's formal rite of thanksgiving and purification performed 40 days after delivery, was the official marker of a woman's return to full marital and social life. The new mother knelt at the church door, holding a lit candle, while the priest said the blessing over her, a survival rite. And then, formally welcomed back into the world, you were expected again. Your body was a resource. Its recovery was a brief interruption of its primary function. The historical record preserves the name of Marjorie Kemper of Lynn, mystic, pilgrim, and author of what is considered the first autobiography in the English language. She bore 14 children. After the birth of her first, she went through nearly 8 months of what modern medical historians identify as postpartum psychosis, hallucinations, self-harm, violent terrors, resolved only, she later wrote, when Christ appeared at her bedside. Years later, After many more children, she negotiated with her husband for a vow of mutual chastity. She was considered extraordinary for asking. She was considered fortunate for being granted it. Most women were neither. The prayers scratched into manuscript margins, the invocations of St. Margaret, the birth girdles and candles and herbs. These are not the artifacts of people who were resigned. They are the artifacts of people who were afraid, doing everything they could think of in the absence of the one thing that would have actually helped. Knowledge. Just knowledge. And that brings us back to Agnes, still in that room, still breathing, and to what her survival actually meant. Agnes survived. The child was a girl. Thomas was allowed back into the room. He stood in the doorway, looking at his wife on the pallet, pale, diminished, alive, and said something the historical record does not preserve. Marjorie packed her things and walked home in the cold. She would do this again next month for someone else. 40 days later, Agnes walked to the church door in clean linen. She knelt at the threshold, holding a lit candle, and the priest said the churching blessing over her, the Benedictio Mulieris postpartum, a prayer of thanksgiving for her survival, a formal welcome back to the life that had almost ended. Not a death rite, a survival rite. The distinction mattered. She was 22 years old. She had a daughter. She would do this again. Agnes didn't know about bacteria. She didn't know about sterile technique, hemorrhage protocols, or epidurals. She didn't know that in 700 years, someone would watch her story on a screen and understand, in a way she never could, exactly how close the margin had always been. But she lit her candle. She said her prayer. She walked back into the world. That is what survival looked like in the 1300s. Not triumph, not recovery, just still here,